Hey guys, today we are going to be watching 5 worst times and places to be alive in human history by Unknown 5. Definitely a different video than what I usually do, as it's not much history, but kind of is, you know? I apologize for my unprofessional face right now. I am far too lazy to shave right now. I'll probably end up shaving later, maybe, I don't know. I might just keep being lazy. We'll see. We'll see if I continue to be unprofessional. Anyways, let's go ahead and watch this video and see if I agree on these being the worst times and places to be alive.
Disaster and tragedy, and perhaps it says something about mankind that this list could have easily had hundreds of entries. Whether as a result of disease, war, famine, or a combination of the three,
definitely could be way worse. Could be way longer.
Sheer hell to live through. Here are my choices.
I'm gonna say World War I trenches. That's definitely probably in here. Bubonic plague, Europe. Where else? World War II, Poland. Yeah. That I would not want to live there for. I think that's my number one. Despite me, actually no, because I'm Germanic. I look German-ish. Well, because my family's German, and I lived in that area at the time when the Russians started coming through, you know, I probably could end up dead from the Soviet forces. What's another? Where do I want to say? Incan Aztec Empire area during when the Europeans started arriving. Because if I was a Native American, native at the time, I would have probably died from disease. And then probably Hiroshima and Nagasaki for obvious reasons. Those are my top 5 that I can think of. Oh wait, Genghis Khan's conquests, because he murdered a lot of people.
Choices for 5 of the worst times to be alive. Number 5, Europe during the Black Death. Life in medieval
Called it.
Europe was already a backbreaking, brutal, and often short existence. However, the arrival of 12...
Not necessarily short. I think that's a misconception, and I'm not gonna knock him for this. It's a very known misconception, you know, because of Hollywood. If you made it past childhood, you most likely would live into your 50s and 60s if you didn't get drafted into a war. Because the diet for a farmer, it wasn't that bad. As we've seen in a previous video of mine, in which we looked at what did peasants eat daily, what could they have expected to eat. They ate, in relation to the way the poor, eat in our modern day, the peasantry ate way better than them. Honestly, they had bread that is actually typically seen as being more expensive today than basic white bread, while the nobility would pay more for white bread back in the day. They had vegetables in their diet, not fruit. Maybe if they had an apple tree or something in their land, possibly, maybe they could get some apples. There was some meat there too in the diet. Not a whole lot. Meat didn't start becoming Meat necessarily was never that big part of the human diet until really the last century, when we started to really get those big farms, the fast food kind of farms, stereotypical farms that you think of when you think of animal farms and such. For fast food restaurants, cramped, enclosed, very awful conditions for the animals.
12 Genoese merchant ships in October of 1347 brought with them microscopic passengers that would unleash a reign of death and terror that would wipe out as much as 60% of Europe's population.
1/3, 60%, yeah, 2/3 of Europe's population just gone in the matter of a few years. Just terrible. That's just
widely
terrifying.
Regarded as one of the most devastating outbreaks in human history, the pandemic that would become known as the Black Death would leave as many as 200 million people dead across Europe and Asia, before it finally subsided, reducing the world's
That sounds like a lot in our time period. 200 million. Well, proportionally, way higher than that if this were to happen today. So, always gotta. When it comes to numbers like these, when it comes to the loss of human life during these time periods, I always then try and think of the math as to what that number would look like today. Like, in this time period, Earth's population was not above 1 billion yet. Or if maybe it was just barely over 1 billion or something at this time. We're at 7 billion. And they lost 200 million people at this time period. That would be like 2 to 3 billion people today, I think. If my math is roughly right. If my math is even close.
population by up to 22%. Such numbers of deaths are difficult to comprehend, yet the death toll was so high that it's as if a nuclear war was unleashed upon the medieval world, with so many lost that it would take over 300 years for the world's population to reach its pre-plague level. The tiny bacterium responsible for
However, if we were to lose half of our population now, we'd only be set back to the 1970s. So we would probably get that population back really
so
fast.
much human misery thrived in the unsanitary and densely populated towns and cities of Europe. In some cases, as many as 80% of the population would perish, with many smaller settlements left permanently abandoned, their
Yeah,
former inhabitants
some
dead or
villages
fleeing
were
in
just
terror.
completely gone.
The appearance of boils oozing blood and pus in the groin,
Ugh.
armpits, or neck would for many be the first sign that they were condemned to a painful and unavoidable death. The boils would often be as large as apples, and accompanied
And it was
by
a
terrible
fast
fever and
transmission
the vomiting
too.
of blood.
Like if you got
And death
infected, the
was
moment
all
you got
but
infected, you had
guaranteed
maybe
to come within just 7
couple
days of
days left.
infection, although often much faster. Many chroniclers at the time wrote of how a person might go to sleep at night in perfect health, only to be dead by morning. The Black
Yeah, a
Death
couple
went
days
hand
was
in
for the
hand
lucky.
with terror, and it must have seemed as if the apocalypse had arrived, as people struggled to understand just what was causing the outbreak. The plague did not discriminate. Rich and poor, nobleman and commoner, all were struck down together. In the face of such an unknown force, many turned to the heavens in search of an answer, believing that the disease was caused by astrological forces, earthquakes, or even as divine punishment from God for the sins of man. Gripped by fear, many took to the streets to engage in public displays of penance in an effort to win forgiveness from God, and the sight of processions of flagellants travelling from town to town as they beat themselves bloody became common. However, their suffering would prove to be in vain, and the plague continued to ravage their world. Panic was rife as the healthy did everything in their power to avoid the infected. Doctors refused to treat their patients, priests ignored the cries of the dying, and parents even abandoned their sick children. Hell on earth had truly arrived, and all around were bodies piled high in the streets or buried in great pits, the sick often abandoned and sealed up in their homes. Fields were left unploughed, crops unharvested, and animals untended as there was nobody left alive or willing to do the work. After all, why work today when tomorrow you might be dead? People became ever more distrustful of each other, as you never know who might be infected, and waking up each morning would have
This is
involved
weird
the
to watch it in
terrifying
this
routine of
when
checking
I'm watching
yourself
this.
for the lumps and
Watching it in
boils that
2020
might signal that
in the
you
United
too
States
were
of
soon to
America.
join the ever-growing ranks of the dead. Number 4. China during the Mongol invasion. The
Mongols
Chinese
called
had long
it.
interfered in the
Except I think I personally would put Baghdad during the Mongol invasions much higher. I think it was Baghdad. I don't think Baghdad ever really recovered from what happened to it during the Mongol invasions. I think it was Baghdad. There was some Middle Eastern city that got absolutely ruined. Like most of its population just gone because of the Mongols.
the affairs of the Mongolian tribes, encouraging rivalries and warfare between the tribes in an attempt to keep them divided and weak. Such interference was not forgotten by Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan after uniting all of the Mongol tribes under his sole leadership, and it was the ordinary people of China who would pay the price when in 1205 the Mongol invasion commenced, a conquest which was begun by the Great Khan, continued by his son Ogadai, and completed by his grandson Kublai. 3 generations of the same family would conduct a 74-year-long campaign that was unbelievable in its brutality and scale, reducing countless cities to rubble, bringing down
Yeah.
ancient empires that were thought
Yeah, if you thought Carthage was bad, what Rome did to Carthage, whew, what the Mongols did to a lot of cities, not only in China and not just in Asia, but across their empire. Oh,
to be
it's horrifying.
invincible, and sending millions
But obviously, if you submitted, I don't think it was all too bad, as long as you submitted early. If you fought them, you most likely would
of
die.
innocent people to an early grave. By the time the dust had settled, China was completely conquered, ruled by a foreign emperor for the first time in its history.
And I think the only time
Estimates
in its
regarding
history.
just how many people were
Well, obviously, parts of China would get ruled by Japan during, obviously, World War II, and the Sino-Chinese Wars, or whatever it's called. But not all of China would be conquered by the Japanese.
erased from history.
This is the only
by
time
this
where all of
invasion
China was
very
actually
wildly.
controlled by a
However,
foreign
census
power.
conducted a few years after the conquest showed that the population had been cut in half, from 120 million people before the invasion
In
to
half.
just 60 million after.
Imagine that today. China's population cut in half. China right now has, 1.4 billion? 700 million people would be dead. 700 million. That is insane.
While this may have not been completely accurate, it points to the likelihood that tens of millions of lives were snuffed
Yeah.
out, either killed directly by the Mongols,
Censuses
or
obviously
dying
during
as a
this time
result of
period
the
most likely were
subsequent
not.
famines caused by the chaos they unleashed.
I mean, censuses aren't
Being
even
a
that
Chinese
accurate
citizen
today
during
because some
this
people
period
don't want
would have been a
to,
terrifying and extremely dangerous existence.
report for reasons.
Although the
So back
entirety
then,
of China would suffer, it was
much
northwest
harder.
China that would bear the brunt of the Mongol fury. Prior to the invasion, the region was a center of wealth and innovation. However, a poorly judged decision by its rulers would lead to the area becoming largely depopulated, its cities ruined and abandoned, its people dead or fleeing south. The area had been violently subjugated as a vassal of the Great Khan. However, when the Mongols rode east against the Khwarezmid Empire 9 years later, they called upon their Chinese vassals for aid, a request that was foolishly denied. The Khan swore vengeance against the northwestern
that was not a good
Chinese
decision
state,
by
and after
those Chinese
annihilating the
nobles.
Khwarezmid Empire, returned to northwest China to exact revenge. No mercy would be shown, and the Mongol armies methodically moved from city to city, slaughtering everyone and leaving the once great settlements that dotted the landscape in ruins, never to be inhabited again. Such was the devastation that Chinese sources claim that less than 1% of the population survived the carnage in the northwest. As the invasion moved south, fear
Wow.
spread amongst the people like a plague. News of Mongols on the horizon would spread panic and terror, as the people were well aware of the fate that would await them should they resist, and many cities would throw open their gates and surrender without a fight. Submitting to the Khan might
I mean, who wouldn't if you hear about that? Surrender to the
be
Mongols.
mercy, however resistance would be punished with massive destruction and death. Their tactics included burning farmland to starve out the population who were resisting, diverting rivers into cities to flood defenders out, and even catapulting diseased corpses over city walls to infect the population inside, a practice which some have suggested may have brought the Black Death to Europe during the later siege of the Genoese city of Kaffa. Yet the vital decision on whether to surrender would have been out of the hands of the common man on the street, and should your rulers choose to resist, you might have found yourself one of the countless millions who were corralled like animals through their city's gates before being decapitated one by one in an almost industrial manner, your head neatly stacked into a grotesque pyramid alongside everyone you had ever known. Number 3. The Americas during colonization.
So far, I'm 3 for 3, baby.
Exactly how many people were living in the Americas prior to the voyage of Columbus in 1492 is difficult to estimate, with numbers varying from 10 million all the way up to 100 million. Yet what is known?
I think probably 30 million would be a safe bet. Because there was supposedly around 1 million in Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. Incan Empire probably had a few million. I think 100 million is way too high. I mean, yeah, it's a big the Americas are huge, but I don't think tribes outside of the Incan and Aztec empires, and then Pueblo in their like carved out cities. I don't think there are really many places of large human urban populations. I think 30 to 50 million is probably the better estimate in my opinion, just based off of what I know. I don't really know any true numbers.
Is that contact with European settlers brought about a massive population decline that would destroy entire tribes, societies, and cultures, leaving much of the continent resembling a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Before Europeans arrived, the Americas had been isolated from the rest of the world, and as such, the people living there had never been exposed to diseases, which were now common in the Old World, meaning that they had not built up the same level of resistance.
And that level of resistance is built up because they didn't have like cows. Pigs, I think. Cows and pigs, I think, weren't native to the Americas. So yeah, that disease that you get by living with those kinds of animals for centuries and centuries, or well, millennia and millennia, the natives of the Americas did not have that. So it was not purposeful. In most cases, it was not purposeful for the colonists in the killing by disease of the natives. Now, there would become instances where colonizers would purposefully give natives like smallpox blankets, that did occur. But the large majority of the death of the natives was spread just from coming into contact with the Europeans
had, nor had they adequate medicines to treat them. The results were devastating.
I don't even think the Europeans really could have
after
treated them
contact was made with
at the
European
time.
settlers, epidemics of diseases such as smallpox spread across the continent like wildfire.
Because I don't think at this time, especially, I don't think Europeans really had treatments for it. They maybe have had guesses that might work for a little bit or help the pain or something, but I don't think they really had treatments to cure it. They mainly just really had built up an immunity to it over time.
Killing staggering numbers of people. These losses destroyed entire communities, as there were now far fewer people left alive to hunt and plant crops, or care for the sick and dying. A tribe's food supply would have been diminished, further weakening its people and rendering them even more vulnerable to the next outbreak of disease. With so few people left alive to perform crucial tasks, established society fell apart, and those who did survive would have witnessed their entire world collapsing as friends and family died horrible deaths, and their very way of life was slowly destroyed. As the diseases raced across the land, the European settlers moving inland would have likely only been encountering the scattered bands of traumatized survivors who had somehow made it through this biological apocalypse, now left weakened and ripe for conquest. It's thought that some tribes lost over 50% of their people to disease, while smaller tribes were often wiped out entirely.
Yeah.
Some estimates even suggest that up to 90% of the Native American population died as a result of diseases in the century following the arrival of Europeans.
I don't think that's too hard to really, disbelieve. I don't think that's too hard of a statistic to, believe. I think that's pretty reasonable in terms of the amount of death. I think 90% when coming into contact with a foreign peoples who have lived for millennia and millennia with creatures that you've never even seen or heard of before, that have never lived in your lands, it'll spread quick. You don't know what you're dealing with. So I think 90% of the population is possible. It's highly probable.
Such numbers would make these epidemics far more deadly than the Black Death which had ravaged Europe just a couple of centuries before, leading it to be described as the greatest catastrophe in human history. Yet, as if deadly diseases were not bad enough,
he really likes
many
his dancing
natives
skeletons.
also had to contend with brutal wars and a miserable life of slavery should they be taken captive.
Yep.
Up against
Obviously not, my previous statements are not taken away from this fact of existing. Obviously, yes, the wars did happen, but the large portion of death was from unknown diseases, essentially. Like, especially at this time, you cannot Now, what you can do is you can blame the Europeans for their ideas of conquest. Obviously, that is they. You can argue like not justified to go and conquer random people just because they're not the same as you. That's not justifiable. But I think it's unfair to say that the Europeans knew what they were doing in terms of spreading disease. I don't think there's any way that they could have known that by interacting with these people, they were spreading disease that would literally wipe them off. I don't think with their medical knowledge at the time, I don't think that was possible to know.
Invaders with more advanced weaponry, who were better supplied and able to fight all year round, battles routinely descended into massacres as tribes were driven off land they had lived on for centuries, while others were forced into the mines to enrich the very people who had brought about the calamity.
This is my new Shakaroni pizza. Extra cheese, extra pepper.
Number 2. China during the Great Leap Forward.
Great Leap. Damn it! I was hoping for a 5 for 5, but yeah, this makes sense. Great Leap Forward. I'm going to explain it real quick before he does. Great Leap Forward is Mao Zedong's attempt at, I guess, modernizing China. And in one of those steps is he calls for the execution, or the killing of these like sparrows or something. These sparrows killed certain bugs. These bugs that these sparrows ate were bugs that destroyed crops. Now, with those sparrows being hunted, because Mao for some reason thought the sparrows were bad, now you're having these swarms of these bugs that are now eating all of your crops. And I think an estimated 50 to 60 million Chinese men and women and children all died of famine.
In the late 1950s, China's leader, Chairman Mao, undertook an economic and social plan which was intended to bring about rapid modernization. However, instead of turning the country into a modern paradise, the plan instead transformed China into a catastrophic nightmare that would claim the lives of up to 55 million people in just 4 years. He decided that in order for the country to transform from a farming economy to an industrial one, private ownership would need to be abolished, and by the end of 1958, 25,000 communes had been set up, each containing an average of 5,000 families. In the communes, hundreds of millions of people were forced to produce grain, which could be exported in exchange for hard currency, the people no longer working for wages, as money had instead been replaced by a system of work points. Everything was now owned by the commune, and every aspect of the individual's life was controlled by the commune they were a part of. Ancient customs such as funerals, festivals, and weddings were deemed to be counter-revolutionary and banned, instead replaced with versions deemed acceptable by the Communist Party, and even the idea of personal liberty became a faint memory. The results proved to be disastrous. Millions of skilled farmers were moved from agricultural to industrial work, leading to much of the harvest being left to rot in some areas, as there were simply not enough people left to collect it. Natural disasters such as flooding and a devastating locust swarm compounded the problem,
There's the
leading to a
locusts,
mass
as I was
famine
talking
which would
about.
cause millions to starve to death. In a sickening irony, the locust swarm was actually caused by Mao's policy, as sparrows had been killed off after being classified as pests due to their tendency to eat grain seeds. However, the sparrows were also natural predators of locusts, and with the sparrow population now decimated, there was nothing left to keep locust numbers in check. Starving, exhausted workers were forced with threats of violence to literally work themselves to death in the fields, and anyone caught growing food for themselves would be executed. Terrified commune leaders would over-report their production numbers, meaning they were forced to hand over ever greater amounts of food while their people starved, and simply reporting the real harvest numbers could lead to execution. Those deemed too old or ill to be efficient workers were banned from the commune canteens, and therefore intentionally starved to death, and even fleeing a badly hit area was not an option, as travel was forbidden. Those who failed to meet their quotas, or committed any number of acts now deemed to be a crime, were buried alive, tied up, and thrown into ponds, or simply beaten to death. In fact, the murders were so numerous that it's thought that around 8% of those who died during the Great Leap Forward were violently killed, and up to 3 million people are estimated to have simply committed suicide, choosing to end their suffering rather than continue to live on in misery.
3 million?
As society broke down, robberies and raids on neighbouring villages became common as people desperately sought food to survive, and reports of cannibalism became widespread. Yet Mao refused all offers of international aid, and sickeningly the country continued to be a net exporter of grain despite the famine. The program was finally repealed in the early 1960s, and the communal system was broken up. However, Mao's insane experiment had already doomed millions to a painful and often drawn-out
Tens
death.
of millions.
Number 1. Europe during the first half of the 20th century.
Oh, okay. So they're lumping in World War I and World War II together. So I'm 4 for 5.
The 20th
Not
century
bad.
has perhaps seen the highest concentration of events that have caused unbelievable suffering and misery in all of human history. Within the space of just 30 years, 2 world wars were fought, and across the globe, genocides and mass murders have been committed in the name of political ideologies that have seen hundreds of millions perish. While
Yeah.
any of these scenarios on their own was no doubt a nightmare to live through, there did exist a group of people who were born in just the right time and place to ensure that their lives would chart an especially unfortunate course that would see them experience all of the horrors and miseries that humans have contended with since the dawn of time, packed in
Yeah, imagine that you're born in I guess 1902. You turn 16 in 1918. You can enlist in the war then. Or you lie to get enlisted in the war because you somehow think at this point in 1918 that the war is still justifiable and you must still fight for your country. You would still then be old enough to be drafted into World War II, at least in its outbreak. Ooh,
into just one
oh,
lifetime.
thank you.
A man born in Europe in the closing years of the 19th century would have come of age at the beginning of the Great War, and would have no doubt been swept up in the patriotic fervour that gripped the continent, enlisting in the army to fight for his country.
As I was saying,
The First World War was the first truly modern war, during which mankind's rapidly advancing technology was deployed to deadly effect, dispensing levels of death previously unseen on the battlefield. Casualties numbering in the thousands during just one day of battle were no longer unusual, and the sight of your friends being cut to pieces by machine gun fire, blown apart by high explosive shells, choked and poisoned by deadly gases, or stabbed and beaten to death by brutal close combat weapons would have been enough to send even the most stable individual mad. Yet this procession of carnage would be repeated again and again, as wave after wave would be sent into the meat grinder, only to be beaten back again. In a war where individual battles would routinely kill hundreds of thousands, even if the young man who had enlisted in 1914 was not one of the estimated 38 million military and civilian casualties, he was still in grave danger when the war ended in 1918, which was the year that the Spanish flu pandemic began
oh yeah, I
spreading
forgot
across the
about
planet.
that.
Between January 1918 and December 1920, this
think 55
especially
million as
deadly
well.
and aggressive strain of flu killed up to 100 million people, which was
Ooh,
5%
they're going high estimates for the Spanish flu.
of the world's total population, which had already dipped after the slaughter of the Great War, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history, and possibly killing more.
Not to mention the weakening immune systems that were common of soldiers in the trenches just because of the conditions of the trenches. So that spread
More
rapidly
than the
in there.
Black Death in medieval Europe. Unusually, this strain of flu seemed to target healthy young adults, meaning veterans who had managed to survive the carnage of the First World War were especially vulnerable to its effects, hundreds of thousands of whom would die.
I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say those that fought in the trenches are really healthy. You've got those trenches were awful conditions. You had really, for a lot of the Western forces as well, there was a trouble of food. And you had to kill rats at times to survive. So yeah,
And especially
wouldn't
nasty
necessarily
death as a
stay
result
healthy.
of pneumonia or massive hemorrhages in the lungs. Those who managed to survive these two calamities might have finally started to piece their lives back together during the 1920s.
And then
However,
World War
trouble was
II
still
and the Great
ahead,
Depression.
This time in the
Or, well,
form
Great
of an
Depression, then
economic
World War
crash
II,
that
yep.
became known as the Great Depression, which during the 1930s would lead to incomes plummeting while unemployment skyrocketed, reaching as high as 33% in many countries, leading to nearly a decade where simply getting enough food to eat and keeping a roof over your head was a battle in itself. It could be said that the First World War and this Great Depression sowed the seeds for the most devastating conflict of all time, the Second World War, which would inflict an estimated 80 million casualties worldwide, and for perhaps millions of men would mark the second time they fought in a world war in the service of their country. It's difficult to imagine just how it would have felt to have survived these deadly events, perhaps thinking that you really had fought the war to end all wars, only to witness the world plunged into madness and slaughter for a second time, and to be called up to relive the horror all over again. Just how many men would survive the First World War, only to perish in the Second, once again experiencing the destruction technology could wreak on the battlefield, as more advanced tanks, aircrafts and rockets were all added to the already deadly arsenals of the great powers, and would reduce much of Europe to rubble over the course of 6 bitter years of fighting, during which human decency itself seems to have broken down, as people fought with a level of brutality and cruelty that before the war might have seemed unbelievable. In fact, there was no doubt an unfortunate but sizable group of men who would experience and survive the misery of the First World War, Spanish flu, Great Depression, and Second World War, only to end their lives in a distant Siberian gulag, the suffering they had endured and even their very names, forgotten by the world they were once a part of. So those are my...
I agree with the list. Yeah. No, yeah. I don't really have any disagreements there with that list. That's a good list of 5 terrible times to live. Or, well, you'd live for a little bit, then you'd probably die. I was 4 for 5 on my guesses. I can't believe I forgot about Mao Zedong's policy on China, or on the sparrows. I should have guessed that. I should have known. But, yeah. I think I don't have really anything else to comment on. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Thank you.